December 16, 1985, 5:25 p.m., East 46th Street, Manhattan. Paul Castellano stepped out of his black Lincoln Town car in front of Sparks Steakhouse. 70 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, wearing a $3,000 overcoat and a diamond pinky ring worth more than most people's homes. He was the most powerful crime boss in America, boss of the Gambino family, the richest mobster who ever lived. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He never made it to the restaurant door. 6 men in identical white trench coats and Russian fur hats emerged from the Manhattan crowd. They moved with military precision, no hesitation, no mercy. The first shot hit Castellano in the head. He collapsed on the sidewalk. His driver, Tommy Bellotti, tried to run. They gunned him down beside the car. 12 shots total. Both men dead in under 30 seconds. Then something extraordinary happened. Dark sedan pulled up. A man in a fedora stepped out. He walked calmly past the bodies, surveyed the scene like a general inspecting a battlefield, and nodded with satisfaction. Then he got back in his car and disappeared into the night. That man was John Gotti. And what he'd just witnessed wasn't a random hit. It was a coup, the most brazen assassination in American mob history. A murder that shattered 50 years of Mafia tradition and changed organized crime forever. But here's what nobody tells you about that night outside Sparks Steakhouse. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment killing. This was a betrayal 3 years in the making. A betrayal that started with a telephone call Paul Castellano should never have made. A betrayal that began when the richest mobster in America made the fatal mistake of forgetting where he came from. This story doesn't start on East 46th Street. It starts 20 years earlier in a Brooklyn butcher shop where a young man named Paul Castellano learned that the biggest scores don't come from guns and violence. They come from patience, intelligence, and understanding how money really works. And here's the twist that changed everything. The man who killed Paul Castellano that night wasn't his enemy. He was his protégé. The street punk Paul had elevated from nothing to captain, the man Paul trusted with his life. But trust in the Mafia is the most dangerous weapon of all. Let's go back to where it started. Brooklyn, 1915. But here's what nobody expected. The man who would become the richest mobster in American history almost never joined the Mafia at all. Paul Castellano was born Constantino Paul Castellano on June 26, 1915 in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. His father, Giuseppe Castellano, came from Sicily in 1895 with nothing. He found work as a butcher, eventually opening a small shop on 86th Street. The family lived above the shop, 6 kids, no money, but Giuseppe had something valuable. He had a brother-in-law named Carlo Gambino. Now, here's the thing about Carlo Gambino. He wasn't just any brother-in-law. He was connected. By the 1920s, he was running crews for the family that would eventually bear his name. Giuseppe's butcher shop became a front. Money got washed through meat sales. Stolen goods moved through the back door. Young Paul grew up watching, learning, understanding that legitimate business and crime weren't opposites. They were partners. And that understanding would eventually make him worth $200 million, but it would also get him killed. Paul was different from other mob kids. He was tall, imposing, but he wasn't a fighter. He was a thinker. While other teenagers were stealing cars and getting into street fights, Paul was studying business, learning how money moved, how deals got made. He graduated high school, rare for his neighborhood. He could have gone to college. Instead, he went to work for his uncle Carlo. But here's what's fascinating about young Paul Castellano, 25 years. Later, that same butcher shop kid would be ordering the deaths of grown men from his Staten Island mansion. He'd control more money than some Fortune 500 companies, and he'd make one critical mistake that would put him directly in the crosshairs of a street punk named John Gotti. The irony? John Gotti was everything Paul wasn't, everything Paul looked down on, everything Paul thought the Mafia needed to evolve beyond. In 1937, at 22 years old, Paul married Nina Mano. She was 19, beautiful, from a good Sicilian family. Carlo Gambino arranged the marriage. That's how these things worked. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances, about bringing the right families together. Paul and Nina were perfect on paper, Catholic, traditional, committed to the life. But here's what nobody tells you about that marriage. It would last 48 years. Nina would watch her husband become the most powerful mobster in America. She would live in a mansion, travel the world, and enjoy wealth most. People can't imagine. And then, in 1985, she would watch it all crumble because Paul made one fatal decision that destroyed everything they'd built. Paul started in the family business the traditional way: collections, enforcement, moving stolen goods. But Carlo Gambino recognized something in his nephew. Paul had vision. He could see opportunities other guys missed. While most mobsters were thinking about this week's score, Paul was thinking about next year's empire. And that vision would make him incredibly rich. It would also make him incredibly arrogant. In the 1940s, Paul convinced Carlo to invest in legitimate businesses: meatpacking, construction, food distribution. They bought small companies, installed family members as managers, used union connections to eliminate competition. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't exciting, but it was profitable, incredibly profitable. Here's what's brilliant about Paul's strategy. While other mobsters were fighting over street corners, Paul was taking over entire industries. While they were stealing thousands, he was skimming millions. While they were getting arrested for violence, he was building a fortune through paperwork. But that same intelligence that made him rich also made him enemies, because in the Mafia, there's nothing more dangerous than a boss who thinks he's better than everyone else. By 1950, Paul Castellano was running multiple businesses: Scara Mix Concrete Company, which supplied concrete for major construction projects across New York; Dial Poultry, which processed chicken for grocery chains; Blue Ribbon Meats, which had contracts with restaurants from Brooklyn to Manhattan. On paper, Paul Castellano was a successful businessman. In reality, he was a money-making machine for the Gambino family. But here's what nobody saw coming. The same business genius that was making Paul rich was also isolating him from the street soldiers who actually kept the family running. And one of those street soldiers was watching, learning, planning. His name was John Gotti, and he was everything Paul hated about the old Mafia. Here's how Paul's empire worked. He controlled concrete. Through Scara Mix and other companies, Paul had a monopoly on concrete supply in large sections of New York City. Want to build a skyscraper? You bought concrete from Paul. Want to repair a bridge? You bought concrete from Paul. The city couldn't function without Paul Castellano's permission. Think about that for a moment. One man controlling an essential resource for an entire city. It was brilliant, it was profitable, and it was completely legal on paper. But the street guys didn't understand the brilliance. They saw Paul getting rich while they were still collecting gambling debts and breaking legs for loan sharks. They saw their boss wearing 3,000 suits while they were splitting a few $100s from a poker game. Resentment was building. By 1970, Paul Castellano was worth an estimated $30 million, equivalent to over $200 million a day. He lived in a mansion in Staten Island called the White House because of its imposing white columns. The house had 17 rooms, a swimming pool, and grounds that covered an entire city block. Paul employed a full-time staff: drivers, bodyguards, housekeepers, gardeners. He lived like royalty. And royalty, as history teaches us, eventually gets its head cut off. But Paul had a problem. He wasn't officially the boss yet. Carlo Gambino was still alive, still making the big decisions, and Carlo had traditional ideas about what the family should be doing. Street rackets, gambling, loan sharking, the old ways. Paul wanted to modernize, to focus entirely on legitimate businesses that generated massive profits with minimal risk. But he had to wait. While Paul was waiting, something crucial was happening in Queens. A teenage car thief named John Gotti was making his bones in the Fulton Rockaway boys, and the collision course between these two men was already set. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack at his home in Brooklyn. He was 74 years old. The most powerful crime boss in America was dead. And according to his will, Paul Castellano was named his successor. This decision would cost Paul his life. The appointment shocked everyone. Traditional wisdom said the boss should be chosen by the captains, the senior members of the family. But Carlo had made the choice himself. He wanted Paul because Paul represented the future. Paul was the businessman who could take the family into the next century. But here's what Carlo Gambino didn't see. He didn't see that Paul's intelligence would become arrogance. He didn't see that Paul's business sense would isolate him from the streets. And he didn't see that 9 years later, Paul's own protégé would walk up to him outside a Manhattan restaurant and blow his head off. Not everyone agreed with Carlo's choice. Agnello Neil Della Croce was Carlo's underboss, the number 2 man in the family. Della Croce was old school, a killer, a street guy, someone who believed the family should stay in the traditional rackets. Della Croce had his own supporters, captains who thought Paul Castellano was too soft, too removed from the streets. One of those captains was a young, ambitious man named John Gotti. And Gotti was watching. Gotti was learning. Gotti was waiting for his chance. But Carlo's decision was final. On October 25, 1976, Paul Castellano was officially installed as boss of the Gambino crime family. At 61 years old, he was now the head of the largest, richest, most powerful crime family in America. Over 300 made members, thousands of associates, operations in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Florida, Nevada, and California. An annual income estimated at over $100 million. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Paul's first act as boss was controversial, and it would plant the seed of his own destruction. He moved family headquarters from the traditional social clubs in Brooklyn and Manhattan to his Staten Island mansion. The White House became the center of Gambino operations. Captains had to drive to Staten Island for meetings. Soldiers had to report to Staten Island for orders. Paul was literally and figuratively removing himself from the streets. This caused resentment, this caused anger, and this caused a street punk from Queens to start planning his murder. In the traditional mafia, the boss was supposed to be accessible, visible, connected to the neighborhood. Paul was becoming isolated, aristocratic, removed from the daily lives of his soldiers. He wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, lived in a mansion. The guys on the street started calling him the Pope because he acted like he was above everyone else. But here's what those street guys didn't understand. Paul's business approach worked. Under his leadership, Gambino family income exploded. Construction rackets alone generated over $50 million annually. Paul had infiltrated the concrete, electrical, and plumbing unions. He could shut down any major construction project in New York City with a single phone call. Developers paid him millions just to avoid labor problems. The money was flowing. But respect wasn't. And in the mafia, respect matters more than money. Because money without respect gets you killed. One man watching all of this was John Joseph Gotti Jr., and Gotti didn't like what he saw. John Gotti was born October 27, 1940 in the South Bronx. Everything Paul Castellano wasn't. Where Paul was from a connected family, Gotti's father was a drunk day laborer. Where Paul had opportunities, Gotti had evictions and poverty. Where Paul learned business, Gotti learned survival. The family moved constantly, kicked out of apartment after apartment for non-payment of rent. By the time John was 12, they had landed in East New York, Brooklyn, one of the toughest neighborhoods in the city. And here's what's crucial to understand about John Gotti. He was handsome, charismatic, and completely fearless. He was also everything Paul Castellano looked down on. A street thug who solved problems with violence instead of intelligence, a show-off who attracted attention instead of avoiding it, a traditional mobster who believed in the old ways. The collision between these two men was inevitable, because Paul represented the future of the Mafia, and Gotti represented its past, and in 1985, the past would kill the future. Gotti dropped out of high school at 16 and never looked back. By 18, he was running with the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a street gang connected to the Gambino family. Car theft, burglary, street fighting. Gotti was good at all of it. In 1968, Gotti did something that would change his life forever. He murdered a man in cold blood. James McBratney had kidnapped and killed Carlo Gambino's nephew. Gotti and two associates walked into a Staten Island bar, identified McBratney, and shot him dead. It was a revenge killing ordered by Carlo Gambino himself. Here's what's crucial about that murder. It made Gotti. Carlo Gambino personally sponsored him for membership because of the McBratney hit. When Gotti was released from prison in 1972, he was a made man in the Gambino family. He had his own crew and a piece of territory in Queens. But here's what nobody understood at the time. That same violence that made Gotti's reputation would eventually destroy him. Because violence attracts attention, and attention in the modern mafia was a death sentence. Paul Castellano understood this. That's why he moved away from street violence toward sophisticated white-collar crime. That's why he lived quietly, dressed modestly, and avoided the spotlight. Paul understood that the FBI was watching, that times had changed, that the old ways were finished. Gotti didn't understand any of that, or he didn't care. Gotti ran gambling operations, loan sharking, and truck hijackings. He was successful, but he was also traditional, old school, everything Paul Castellano was trying to move away from. The tension between them wasn't just professional, it was philosophical, it was generational, it was personal, and it was about to explode. By the early 1980s, several factors were aligning to seal Paul Castellano's fate. The FBI was building cases against him using sophisticated surveillance technology. His business empire was attracting federal attention, and within his own family, ambitious captains were questioning his leadership. But the spark that ignited the fire was personal. Paul began an affair with his young Colombian housekeeper, Gloria Olarte. Now, here's why this affair sealed Paul's death warrant. In the traditional mafia, a boss's personal life was supposed to be above reproach. Paul was 70 years old, married for nearly 50 years, but he was obsessed with this young woman. He bought her jewelry, took her on trips, talked to her about family business. The FBI identified Gloria as a security risk. She wasn't Italian, wasn't connected to the life, didn't understand the code of silence. If pressured, she might cooperate. She might reveal everything. But more importantly, Paul's affair was seen by his own men as a sign of weakness, self-indulgence. A boss who couldn't control himself couldn't control the family. And here's what pushed Gotti over the edge. In 1984, Paul ordered Gotti's crew to shut down their gambling operations and give him a bigger percentage of their earnings. To Gotti, this felt like extortion. Paul was taking money from soldiers' pockets to fund his wealthy lifestyle. Then came the federal indictments. In 1984, Paul Castellano was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and murder in 2 separate cases. If convicted, he faced life in prison. Paul hired the best lawyers money could buy, but the writing was on the wall. On December 2, 1985, the final domino fell. Agnello Della Croce died of lung cancer. Della Croce had been the bridge between Paul and the street crews, the only man who commanded respect from both sides of the family. With Della Croce dead, there was no one to keep the peace. John Gotti made his move. According to FBI files and witness testimony that emerged years later, Gotti approached Frank DiCicco, a respected Gambino captain who had served as a liaison between Paul and the street crews. DiCicco was frustrated with Paul's leadership style and agreed that change was necessary. Together, Gotti and DiCicco began planning a coup. The plan was audacious. They would assassinate Paul Castellano in public in Manhattan during rush hour. It would be a statement, a demonstration that the old regime was finished and a new one had begun. But they needed approval from the other New York families. In the commission system established by Lucky Luciano in the 1930s, no boss could be killed without the consent of his peers. Gotti and DiCicco approached Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, boss of the Genovese family, and Anthony Tony Dux Corallo, boss of the Lucchese family. Both men had their own problems with Paul. His construction rackets were cutting into their territories. His wealth and power were making him too independent. After several secret meetings, they gave their consent. Paul Castellano could be eliminated. The planning took months. Gotti recruited 6 killers, all experienced, all loyal to him personally. They needed a location where Paul would be vulnerable. Paul rarely appeared in public without heavy security, but there was one weakness: business dinners. Paul regularly met with associates at upscale restaurants. On December 16, 1985, Paul scheduled a dinner meeting at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan. The meeting was with Frank DiCicco and several other captains to discuss family business. Paul saw it as a routine meeting. Gotti saw it as the perfect opportunity. Here's how the assassination unfolded. At 5:00 p.m., 6 men dressed in identical white trench coats and Russian fur hats took positions around Sparks Steakhouse. The disguises served two purposes. They made the killers difficult to identify, and they created the appearance of a coordinated military operation. At 5:20 p.m., Paul's black Lincoln Town car arrived on East 46th Street. Paul was in the back seat with his driver and bodyguard, Tommy Bellotti. At 5:25 p.m., as Paul stepped out of the car, the assassination team struck. The first shooter approached from the front, firing a .38 caliber pistol at Paul's head. The shot was fired from less than 10 feet away. Paul collapsed immediately. Tommy Bellotti tried to defend his boss. He drew his weapon and attempted to take cover behind the car. 3 killers surrounded him. They fired 12 shots in rapid succession. Bellotti was hit 6 times and died beside the Lincoln. The entire assassination took less than 30 seconds. By 5:26 p.m., both men were dead, and the killers had disappeared into the Manhattan crowd. At 5:30 p.m., as police sirens filled the air, John Gotti drove slowly past Sparks Steakhouse. He was accompanied by Sammy the Bull Gravano, who would later testify that Gotti wanted to see the bodies for himself. Gotti looked out the window at Paul Castellano's corpse, smiled, and said, "The king is dead." But here's what Gotti didn't understand. In killing Paul Castellano, he didn't just eliminate his boss, he eliminated the future of organized crime in America. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within 24 hours, Gotti had called a meeting of all Gambino captains. He announced that he was taking over as acting boss. Frank DeCicco would serve as underboss. The old regime was finished. Most captains accepted the change without objection. They had been frustrated with Paul's leadership for years, but the other New York families were concerned. Paul had been predictable, business-focused, diplomatic. Gotti was volatile, attention-seeking, and prone to violence. The FBI investigation into Paul's murder was extensive, but ultimately unsuccessful. The killers had planned carefully. They left no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no traceable weapons. The case officially remains unsolved. However, Paul's death galvanized the FBI's commitment to destroying the Gambino family entirely. Paul had been a sophisticated adversary who operated through legitimate businesses. Gotti was flashy, visible, and prone to mistakes. Within 6 months of becoming boss, Gotti was under constant surveillance. His social club in Queens was bugged, his car was bugged, his phone calls were monitored. The FBI assigned an entire task force to building a case against John Gotti. Gotti, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention. He dressed in expensive suits, held court at the Ravenite Social Club, and gave informal interviews to reporters. He became known as the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don because early prosecutions failed to convict him. But Gotti's love of the spotlight proved to be his downfall. In 1990, the FBI managed to plant a bug in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club. The recordings captured Gotti discussing murders, including the assassination of Paul Castellano. Most damaging of all, the recordings captured Gotti criticizing and humiliating his underboss, Sammy Gravano. In mob culture, public disrespect is grounds for retaliation, but Gravano couldn't strike back at his boss without facing death himself. Instead, he made a different choice. On November 8, 1991, Sammy the Bull Gravano agreed to cooperate with the FBI. Gravano's testimony was devastating. He admitted to participating in 19 murders, including several ordered by Gotti. He provided details about the assassination of Paul Castellano, naming the killers and describing the planning process. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all charges: murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in federal prison on June 10, 2002, at age 61. But the real tragedy of Paul Castellano's assassination wasn't John Gotti's fate. It was the destruction of everything Paul had built. Under Paul's leadership, the Gambino family had evolved into a sophisticated criminal organization that generated hundreds of millions in revenue through white-collar crimes and business infiltration. They were moving away from street violence toward financial manipulation. They were becoming, in essence, a corrupt corporation. Gotti's takeover reversed that evolution. He dragged the family back to traditional rackets: gambling, loan sharking, extortion, murder. The income dropped dramatically. The federal scrutiny intensified. Within 10 years, most of the family's leaders were either dead or in prison. Here's what Paul Castellano's story teaches us about power, ambition, and betrayal. First, success breeds enemies. Paul was the richest, most powerful mob boss in American history, but his success made him a target for ambitious subordinates who wanted that power for themselves. Second, isolation is dangerous. Paul removed himself from the streets, from the daily operations that kept his family loyal. Leaders who become too distant from their followers risk losing their support when crisis strikes. Third, tradition matters. Paul tried to modernize the Mafia, but his soldiers valued the old traditions: respect, loyalty, and street credibility. When Paul abandoned those traditions, he undermined the culture that held his organization together. Fourth, personal weakness can be fatal. Paul's affair was seen as a betrayal of Mafia values and a security risk. In leadership positions, personal conduct must be above reproach. Finally, violence has consequences. Gotti thought killing Paul would solve his problems. Instead, it triggered a chain of events that destroyed the organization he was trying to control. Today, the American Mafia is a fraction of what it was during Paul Castellano's era. Federal prosecutions and generational change have decimated the traditional crime families. The Italian-American Mafia is now largely a historical curiosity. Paul Castellano's vision of a business-focused crime family might have survived and evolved. We'll never know. What we do know is that his assassination marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of the American Mafia. So what's the legacy of that night outside Sparks Steakhouse? John Gotti got what he wanted. He became boss. He got respect and recognition. He got his name in newspapers and his face on magazine covers. He got to live like the movie gangsters he'd always admired. And then he got life in prison. Paul Castellano, the man Gotti killed to achieve that fame, had managed to avoid prison for 70 years. He'd built an empire, accumulated vast wealth, and lived like royalty while staying one step ahead of law enforcement. If Gotti had been patient, he might have inherited that empire legally when Paul was convicted or died of natural causes. Instead, Gotti chose murder. He chose betrayal. He chose the dramatic gesture over the strategic weight, and that choice destroyed everything both men had worked to build. That's the untold story of Paul Castellano's assassination. It wasn't just a murder. It was a tragic miscalculation that ended the golden age of American organized crime. It was the moment when the Mafia chose tradition over evolution, violence over patience, short-term satisfaction over long-term survival. And it was the beginning of the end. If this story fascinated you, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week, diving deep into the untold stories that shaped organized crime in America. Drop a comment below. What should we cover next? The rise and fall of the Commission, Chicago Outfit's war with the Irish mob, the FBI's infiltration of the Bonanno family? This is Mafia Talks, untold stories from the world of organized crime. The real stories, the ones that reveal how power really works, how empires really fall, and how one wrong decision can destroy everything. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.